The hallway outside the Academy Awards ceremony had the particular electricity of a place where powerful people gathered. Expensive cologne, hushed conversations, the clink of glasses, and the careful performance of people who'd spent their lives being watched. It was 1970, and Hollywood was celebrating itself the way it always did, with champagne and self-congratulation while the rest of America burned. John Wayne stood near the corridor wall, Oscar night still buzzing through him, bourbon loosening the edges of his famous composure. He was 63 years old, undisputed king of the Western, fresh off his win for True Grit, and he carried himself the way men do when they've never once been told to be quiet in a room. Then he saw Muhammad Ali. Ali was there that evening as a guest, 3 years removed from his heavyweight title, still fighting his draft conviction in the courts, still banned from the sport that had made him a legend. He stood tall in a dark suit, unhurried, speaking quietly with a small group near the far end of the corridor. Wayne watched him for a moment. Then he started walking toward him. What happened next took less than 30 seconds. Wayne stopped a few feet away, close enough to be heard by the half-dozen people standing nearby. He looked Ali up and down with the slow, deliberate assessment of a man who'd played conquerors his entire career. Then he smiled, the kind of smile that isn't friendly, and said it. A single remark, casually delivered, racially vicious, the kind of thing certain men said out loud in 1970 because they still believed the room belonged to them. The people nearby went completely still. A publicist took a small, involuntary step backward. Someone stopped mid-sentence. The corridor, loud a moment before, became the kind of quiet that has weight. Muhammad Ali looked at John Wayne for a long moment. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move his body. He simply looked at him the way a man looks at something he's already understood completely. Then he spoke. 3 sentences. Quiet, precise, and so accurate they functioned less like words and more like a mirror held directly in front of Wayne's face. John Wayne's expression changed. For a moment, no one moved. But that moment didn't start there. If this story of dignity meeting arrogance moves you, subscribe and hit the notification bell. More untold stories of Hollywood's real moments are coming your way. The people who witnessed what happened in that hallway would talk about it for decades. Not loudly, not in print, not in the way Hollywood scandals usually traveled, through gossip columns and publicist leaks and carefully managed narratives. This traveled the way true things travel. Quietly, personally, one person telling another over dinner or on a set somewhere years later, prefacing it with, "You have to understand, I was standing right there." What they all remembered first wasn't Ali's words, it was Wayne's face. John Wayne had spent 4 decades perfecting a specific expression, the hard, immovable look of a man who could not be rattled, could not be moved, could not be made to feel anything he hadn't chosen to feel. Directors loved it, audiences trusted it. It was the face of Rooster Cogburn and Ethan Edwards and 100 other men who stared down danger without blinking. It was, in many ways, the most famous face in America. And in that corridor, for just a few seconds, it collapsed. Not dramatically, not the way it would have in one of his films. There was no swelling music, no reaction shot held for 3 full seconds. It was smaller than that, and worse. A flicker behind the eyes, a jaw that tightened and then released. The almost imperceptible shift of a man who has just realized that the ground he was standing on was not as solid as he believed. The people nearby saw it. They looked away quickly, the way you look away from something that feels too private to witness. But they saw it. Ali, for his part, did not watch Wayne's face change. He had already turned back to the people he'd been speaking with before Wayne approached, not dismissively, not theatrically, simply, as if the interruption had been a minor one, as if what had just occurred required no further attention from him. That composure, unhurried, complete, utterly unperformed, was in many ways more devastating than anything he had said. Wayne stood there for a moment longer than was comfortable, then he moved away. His companion that evening, a studio executive who'd been beside him, said nothing. There was nothing to say. They had both seen what everyone in that hallway had seen. A man who had built an entire identity on dominance walked directly into someone who could not be dominated. The bourbon confidence was gone. To understand why 3 quiet sentences could hollow out a man like John Wayne in front of witnesses, you have to go back further. You have to understand who these 2 men were before that corridor, what they each carried into it, and why their collision was always going to end exactly that way. America in 1970 was not one country. It was 2, running parallel and occasionally colliding with tremendous force. There was the America of flag pins and John Ford films, of men who believed the system was fundamentally worth defending. And there was the America of draft cards burning on courthouse steps, of black men returning from Vietnam to cities that still wouldn't serve them at lunch counters. Between those 2 Americas ran a fault line. In 1970, that fault line ran directly through Hollywood. John Wayne was the industry's most reliable mirror. Born Marion Morrison in Winterset, Iowa, he reinvented himself as a symbol of American certainty and built a career on playing men who never doubted, never apologized, and never lost on soil they considered their own. By 1970, he had made over 100 films without ever serving a single day in the military, a fact that followed him quietly his entire career. Yet he portrayed warriors and conquerors with an authority audiences accepted completely. His politics were as large as his screen presence. He supported the House Un-American Activities Committee during the Blacklist era, called the civil rights movement's confrontational tactics dangerous, and said so publicly. He was a man of his era. But being a man of your era has never been an excuse. It has only ever been a description. Muhammad Ali had also chosen his era and paid for that choice with everything. Born Cassius Clay in Louisville, Kentucky, he had grown up in an America that assigned his worth before he opened his mouth. He became the greatest boxer alive, won Olympic gold, then returned home to a country that wouldn't serve him in a restaurant. He converted to Islam, changed his name, and refused military induction, in terms so precise they have never been improved upon. No Viet Cong ever called me N-word. For that refusal, he was stripped of his title, banned from boxing, and faced 5 years in federal prison. He was 25 years old. He gave up the peak years of his athletic career without apology, and without the softening language that might have made white America more comfortable forgiving him. By the time he stood in that Hollywood corridor, Ali had already paid a price that John Wayne, for all his performed toughness, could never have imagined paying. 2 men, 1 hallway, and a collision that was always inevitable. John Wayne had never learned how to lose a room. In 40 years of Hollywood, through hundreds of films and thousands of interviews, he had always been the largest presence in any space he occupied. Not merely because of his physical size, though he was genuinely imposing at 6 feet 4 inches, but because of something more fundamental, the absolute certainty he carried about his own place in the world. Wayne never entered a room wondering whether he belonged. He arrived assuming ownership. That certainty had been built carefully, role by role, decade by decade. The Westerns gave him a template, the lone man of principle who restores order through will and force. He had played that character so completely that the line between the performance and the man had dissolved somewhere around 1950 and never fully reformed. When Wayne spoke about Vietnam, he used the same cadences he used on screen. When he talked about protest and dissent, he sounded like a man delivering lines rehearsed 1,000 times in front of cameras. The performance had become the person. What that meant practically was that Wayne had very little experience with anyone who refused to accept the terms of his performance. Studio executives softened their notes. Journalists framed questions carefully. Co-stars understood the hierarchy. Even his political opponents engaged with the myth rather than the man. Everyone, in their own way, accepted his premise. Muhammad Ali respected nothing about the myth. Wayne had approached with the casual confidence of a man who had never once been refused. The remark was designed to diminish, to remind Ali of a hierarchy Wayne considered settled and permanent. It needed Ali to flinch, even slightly, even for just a moment. Ali had spent his entire adult life refusing to flinch. His response was not angry. Anger would have been easier for Wayne to absorb. It could be dismissed as sensitivity, reframed as aggression. What Ali delivered instead was something Wayne had no defense against. He spoke with the quiet authority of a man who had already made peace with every consequence his honesty might bring. He named exactly what Wayne's remark revealed, not about Ali, but about Wayne himself. The fear beneath the toughness, the smallness beneath the performance. He said it without raising his voice. Then he stopped, because he had said exactly enough. The silence that followed was the loudest thing in that hallway. The witnesses scattered through that corridor processed what they had just seen in different ways. A costume designer who had worked with Wayne on 3 films stood nearest to where it happened. She said later that her first instinct was to look at Wayne's hands. In every film she'd watched him make, his hands were always the last thing to betray emotion. They'd tighten on a gun belt, curl slowly into a fist, give away what his face refused to show. In that hallway, she said, his hands were completely still. And somehow that was worse than anything else. Wayne said nothing for a long moment. Then he nodded once. Not in agreement, not in concession, but in the mechanical way a man nods when his mind has gone somewhere private and his body is still running on automatic. He turned and walked back toward his group. Nobody in his circle said a word. Nobody asked what had happened or tried to fill the silence with something lighter. They simply resumed moving, the way people do when they instinctively understand that whatever just occurred requires no commentary. Ali watched none of it. He had already returned to his own conversation, his voice low and unhurried, his posture unchanged. A journalist nearby who witnessed the exchange later wrote in his private notes, never published during his lifetime, that Ali's composure in that moment was the most complete thing he had ever seen. Not performed composure, not the careful blankness of someone suppressing a reaction, simple, total, untroubled calm. The calm of a man who had faced a federal government, a boxing commission, and the full weight of American public opinion without breaking. One aging actor in a corridor was not going to disturb that equilibrium. In the days following that evening, something small but telling occurred. A reporter interviewing Wayne for a profile asked him directly about Ali, about the draft case, about his return to boxing, about whether Wayne thought Ali deserved his title back. It was exactly the kind of question Wayne had answered a dozen times before with sharp, dismissive certainty. This time he paused. He said something vague about not following boxing closely. Then he changed the subject. The people who had been in that hallway when they heard about the interview recognized what that pause meant. John Wayne had never paused before when the subject was Muhammad Ali. Subscribe and hit the bell. The most powerful stories are the ones that almost disappeared. The story didn't make the newspapers. That was the nature of Hollywood in 1970. Certain things were witnessed by many and reported by none, contained within the industry's elaborate system of mutual protection and carefully maintained image. The publicists understood instinctively that what had happened in that corridor belonged to the category of moments that served no one's interests to print. Wayne's people said nothing, Ali's people said nothing. The witnesses kept it the way people keep things that feel too true and too complete to reduce to a headline. But silence is not the same as disappearance. The story moved through Hollywood the way important things always moved, slowly, personally, carried by people who had been there or knew someone who had. A director heard it from a studio executive. A screenwriter heard it from the director. It accumulated the particular weight that eyewitness accounts gather when they are passed carefully from person to person rather than broadcast carelessly to everyone. By the mid-1970s, nearly everyone who worked regularly in the industry had heard some version of it. The details varied slightly, depending on who was telling it. The essential truth never changed. What also never changed was the description of Wayne in the aftermath. The people who knew him well, who had worked with him across decades and understood his rhythms, noticed something in the months following that evening. It was subtle enough that most people would have missed it entirely. Wayne had always been reflexively dismissive of Ali in conversation, not vicious, but certain, the way he was certain about most things he had decided. That certainty quietly disappeared. He didn't become sympathetic, he didn't offer praise or acknowledgement, he simply stopped. When Ali's name came up, Wayne moved past it without settling into it the way he once had. For a man whose opinions had always arrived fully formed and loudly delivered, that restraint was its own kind of statement. One colleague who noticed the shift asked Wayne about it directly during a film shoot in 1972. Wayne looked at him for a moment without answering. Then he said very quietly that some men you argue with and some men you just have to reckon with. He didn't explain further. He picked up his coffee and walked back to his mark. Nobody who heard that story needed him to explain further. Muhammad Ali outlived the era that tried to destroy him. He outlived the draft conviction which the Supreme Court overturned unanimously in 1971. He outlived the ban, returning to boxing and reclaiming his heavyweight title not once but twice. He outlived the narrative that men like Wayne had constructed around him, the dangerous radical, the ungrateful champion, the man who had chosen the wrong side of history. By the time Ali lit the Olympic torch in Atlanta in 1996, hands trembling with Parkinson's but eyes completely steady, there was not a person watching who did not understand that they were looking at someone who had been right all along. John Wayne died in 1979. His legend survived him in the way legends do, selectively, mythologically, stripped of the complications that made him human. The films remained. The image remained. The America he had performed for 4 decades continued to claim him as its symbol. But the people who had been in that corridor remembered something the legend didn't include. They remembered a man who had walked towards someone he underestimated, and walked away having learnt something he never fully articulated, but clearly never forgot. Ali was asked about Wayne only once in a formal interview, late in his life. The question was framed carefully, giving him room to be generous or to be cutting, whichever he preferred. Ali sat quietly for a moment. Then he said that Wayne was a man who played brave his whole life, and maybe confused that with being brave. He said it without bitterness, without satisfaction, in the same unhurried tone he had used in that Hollywood corridor decades earlier. Then he smiled, that enormous, luminous smile that no amount of illness ever fully extinguished, and moved on to something else. That smile was the whole answer. Some men spend their lives performing who they wish they were. Some men simply are who they are at every moment, in every room, regardless of who is watching or what it costs them. The corridor outside the 1970 Academy Awards was not a historic battlefield. No cameras recorded it. No newspaper reported it. But the people who were there understood that they had witnessed something true, a moment when 2 versions of American manhood stood face to face, and only one of them was real. If this story moved you, subscribe, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and tell us in the comments who in your life has shown that kind of quiet, unshakable dignity.